The first time Grace Sawyer heard the name Orville Keller, it was spoken like a warning. She had arrived in Harlan's Creek, Colorado Territory, on a Thursday in October of 1878, stepping down from a rattling stagecoach with a carpetbag in one hand and a tin pot wrapped in cloth in the other. The town was small and wind-scrubbed, pressed up against the eastern slope of the San Juan Mountains like something that had blown there by accident and simply decided to stay. There was a general store, a livery, a church with a crooked steeple, and a saloon that seemed to be doing better business than any of them. The people were watchful in the way that frontier people always were, measuring strangers quietly before deciding what to do with them. Grace was 26 years old and had come from Pueblo, where her father had died in the spring and left her a small sum, a clear head, and no particular reason to remain. She was not a delicate woman, though she was not a coarse one either. She had brown hair that she kept pinned back with a practical efficiency, gray eyes that had the quality of listening even when she was not speaking, and hands that were already roughened from years of cooking, laundering, and tending the sick in her father's small community. She had answered an advertisement placed by a widow named Elspeth Harrow, who needed a schoolteacher for Harlan's Creek's 12 school-age children. Grace had taught Sunday school in Pueblo. She could do arithmetic and write in a clean hand, and had read more books than anyone in her county. It seemed enough. Elspeth Harrow met her at the edge of the road with the decisive energy of a woman who had kept a town running through sheer force of will. She was 60, broadly built, and smelled of cinnamon and lye soap. She took Grace's carpetbag before Grace could object, and began walking toward a small white house that would be Grace's. "The children are mostly good," Elspeth said, leading her across the packed earth street. "3 of them are Dunnings, and the Dunning boys have a tendency toward mischief, but nothing you cannot handle. School starts Monday. You will ring the bell at 8. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrow," Grace said, looking around at the mountains. They were extraordinary snow already collecting on the upper ridges even in early October, the aspens in the lower valleys blazing gold against the gray rock. She had not expected to find beauty here. It moved her in a way she did not have words for yet. "One other thing," Elspeth said, slowing her pace slightly, and it was in the slowing that Grace sensed the importance of what came next. "Up the mountain, about 4 miles northeast as the crow flies, there is a man named Orville Keller. He lives alone, has for going on 6 years. He comes to town maybe 3-4 times a year for supplies. He does not speak much when he does come. He has made it plain to anyone who has ever tried to befriend him that he wants nothing of the sort. He is not violent, I want to be clear about that, but he is not a man who welcomes approaches. If you see him, it is better to let him pass." Grace absorbed this. "What happened to him?" Elspeth paused, setting the carpetbag down to work the latch on the White House's gate. "Nobody knows the full of it. He came here from somewhere in Wyoming. Had a wife and a son, from what I understand. The wife died. The boy too, I believe, or perhaps the boy was sent somewhere. The stories vary, and he has never confirmed any of it. Whatever the truth is, he carried it up that mountain and has been carrying it alone ever since." She pushed the gate open. "He is not unkind in a threatening way. He simply has no use for people, and especially no use for kindness. He has said as much more than once to those who tried." Grace stepped through the gate and looked at the house. It was plain and clean inside, a small bedroom, a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove that still held warmth from that morning. Someone had placed a jar of dried wildflowers on the windowsill. She thought that was probably Elspeth's doing and felt grateful. "Why are you telling me about him?" Grace asked, setting the tin pot on the table. Elspeth looked at her with something shrewd and affectionate in her expression. "Because you have a kind face, Miss Sawyer. And kind-faced people tend to try to fix things that do not want to be fixed. I am simply preparing you." Grace nodded. She said she understood. And she did understand, in the way you understand a thing before you have actually encountered it. She began teaching school on Monday and found she loved it immediately. The Dunning boys were indeed mischievous, 2 of them, named Colt and Reuben, aged 9 and 11, who seemed to operate under the shared conviction that any moment of stillness was a moral failure. But they were also quick and funny, and Grace discovered that if she gave them things to race each other at who could solve the subtraction problem first, who could recite the most states, they became allies instead of obstacles. The other children were easier. A girl named Rosalie who drew horses in the margins of everything. A solemn boy named Peter who was 9 and read at the level of someone twice his age. They were good children, all of them, doing their best in a hard place, and Grace went home each evening tired in a way that felt earned and good. She settled into the town carefully, the way you learn to settle yourself into a new chair before you trust it fully with your weight. She took her supper sometimes with Elspeth, sometimes with the Dunning family, who despite their boys were warm and generous people. She bought her supplies from a man named Harvey at the general store, who had a kind wife named Lottie who always slipped an extra biscuit into Grace's basket if she happened to be baking that morning. She learned which paths around town flooded after rain, and which side of the church caught the most afternoon light for reading. She was, slowly and deliberately, making herself a life. And then, 3 weeks into her time in Harlan's Creek, she saw Orville Keller. He came into town on a cold November morning, riding a dark bay horse that moved with the careful sureness of an animal accustomed to mountain terrain. He was a large man, not tall in the theatrical way of men who know they are tall, but genuinely, solidly large in the way of someone who had spent years doing physical work in conditions that did not forgive weakness. He wore a heavy wool coat the color of old bark, a battered hat pulled low, and a beard that had been growing for long enough that it had stopped being a choice and become simply a feature of his face. He was perhaps 32, though the mountains had a way of adding years to a person's appearance that made exact estimation difficult. He dismounted at the general store's hitching post with the economy of movement that belonged to men who did not perform anything, ever. He tied the horse, whose name Grace would later learn was Drum with a few quick loops, then went inside without looking at anyone who happened to be passing on the street. Grace was crossing the road at that moment, carrying a bundle of books she had borrowed from Elspeth's modest library. She saw him and recognized in his posture exactly what Elspeth had described, a man who had erected the architecture of solitude around himself so completely, and for so long that it had become structural. You could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way he moved through space as if other people were weather, something to be acknowledged only insofar as it required adjustment, never something to engage with. She went about her day and did not approach him. She was not foolish, but she did watch, from the window of the general store where she had her own errand to run, as Harvey loaded supplies into a pack on the back of Orville Keller's horse. The mountain man said barely 6 words the entire transaction. He paid in coin, exact coin, as if he had counted it out before he came, and left without a backward glance. She noticed that his coat had a tear along the right shoulder that had been repaired roughly with thread that did not match. She noticed that his hands, when he took his change from Harvey, were badly cracked from the cold. She noticed that he bought flour, dried beans, coffee, and rifle ammunition and nothing else. No sugar, no spices, no small comfort of any kind. It was not her business. She went home. But that evening, she made a second pot of the soup she had been cooking for her supper, a good thick beef, and barley that she had learned from her mother, and she sat looking at it for a long time. Then she thought about the torn coat and the cracked hands and the flour with no sugar. Then she told herself firmly that Elspeth had warned her, and that she was not going to be the kind of woman who could not take a reasonable warning. She went to bed. She slept fine. November deepened, and the mountains became serious about their cold. The children in her classroom began arriving with red raw cheeks and steaming breath, and Grace started keeping the wood stove burning from before they arrived until after they left. She heard from Elspeth that the first heavy snow was expected before the end of the month, and she began to understand, viscerally, not just intellectually, what it meant to be isolated on a mountain when the passes filled with snow. She thought about Orville Keller once or twice without meaning to. Not in a romantic way. It was not that, not yet. It was more the kind of thinking you do about a problem that has been put in front of you without your permission and refuses to be entirely set down. She thought about what it meant to choose complete isolation, about whether it was ever truly a choice, or whether it was what happened when grief went unattended long enough that it stopped being grief and became architecture. She baked on Saturdays. It was a habit she had developed in Pueblo, something that connected her to her mother and to a sense of order she found comforting. She made cornbread and sometimes pie if she had the ingredients, and she shared what she made with her neighbors and with whatever children happened to be nearby. It made her happy. It was a simple happiness, the kind she had learned to recognize and protect because she knew that simple happinesses were the ones that sustained you through complicated times. On the first Saturday of December, she made a spiced apple cake. She had a bounty of dried apples that Lottie from the general store had given her, and she added cinnamon and a little of the precious vanilla she had brought from Pueblo, and the result was something that made her small house smell like everything good about autumn, even though the world outside had gone properly to winter. She cut a third of it for herself and wrapped the rest in clean cloth. She stood in her kitchen holding the wrapped cake for a long time. Then she put on her coat, her warmest scarf, and her stout boots, and she walked northeast out of town. She was not going 4 miles. She was not that impulsive. She knew the road that came down from the mountain, and she knew, because she had paid attention in the way that she paid attention to most things, that it passed through a lower section of pine forest about 1.5 miles from town before climbing steeply toward the higher elevations where Orville Keller's cabin sat. She had heard from young Peter, whose older brother did some occasional trapping in the area, that there was a place along the lower road where a flat rock served as an informal waypoint, a spot where travelers ascending or descending the mountain sometimes left messages or small goods for one another. She walked to that flat rock in the cold, clear air of the Saturday afternoon. The sky was the particular deep blue that high altitude produces, and the snow on the ground was perhaps 4 inches deep, compacted and crusted. Her breath came in visible plumes. It took her 30 minutes of brisk walking, and she arrived slightly pink in the face and entirely resolved. She set the wrapped cake on the flat rock. She tucked a corner of the cloth under a smaller stone so the wind would not take it. She looked at it for a moment, then turned around and walked back to town. She told herself it was probably an animal that got it. She told herself she should not think about it further. She thought about it constantly for 4 days. On Wednesday of that week, Elspeth came to find her after school with an expression on her face that was somewhere between admiration and exasperation. She sat herself down in one of Grace's 2 chairs and folded her hands in her lap. "Did you leave something on the mountain road?" she asked. Grace looked at her evenly. "I left something on a rock, on the lower road. A cake, I am told." "Yes. Orville Keller came into town this morning," Elspeth said. "Harvey says he bought sugar. He has not bought sugar in 6 years of coming to this store." Grace felt something move in her chest that she chose not to examine too closely. "That is interesting," she said, in a voice she kept deliberately neutral. Elspeth looked at her with those shrewd eyes. "You are going to be trouble, Miss Sawyer," she said, but there was warmth in it. "I just left a cake on a rock," Grace said. December moved forward with the gravity of a Colorado winter, which was a force not unlike geology, slow, massive, and utterly indifferent to individual comfort. The snow arrived in earnest, and the passes filled as promised, and the world shrank to what could be reached on foot or horse in reasonable weather. Grace's classroom became a warm island in a cold world, and she loved it more than ever. She read to the children from a collection of adventure stories she had brought from Pueblo, and they gathered close to the stove and listened with the concentration of people for whom stories were still revelatory, not entertainment layered over an already full life, but the whole event. She baked again on the following Saturday ginger cookies this time, because she had the molasses and the spices, and because the smell of ginger baking in winter is one of the most unambiguously good things that exists. She made more than she needed, as she always did. She wrapped a portion in cloth. She walked to the flat rock. She set them down. She put the stone on the corner. She walked back. This time she waited 3 days to wonder about it, which she considered an improvement. The snow fell on the 4th day and covered her wondering somewhat. She did not see Orville Keller again in December. She had not expected to. She thought about what his life looked like up there in the snow, the silence of it, the particular completeness of being cut off from everything human for weeks at a time, and she found that she could imagine it with a clarity that surprised her. She had her own experience of silence. After her father had died in the spring, there had been months of a quiet so absolute that it had weight, and she had learned that grief and solitude together could reshape a person from the inside, leaving them with different dimensions than they had started with. She understood, at least in approximation, what that kind of aloneness felt like. She did not understand choosing it as a permanent condition, but she understood arriving at it, and she thought that was perhaps the relevant thing. Christmas came to Harlan's Creek with a modest cheerfulness. Elspeth organized a gathering at the church, and the whole town fit into it with room to spare, perhaps 40 people total, including several ranching families who had ridden in from outlying properties. There was singing and a recitation by the children, and an extraordinary quantity of food contributed by every household. Grace brought cornbread and spiced apple cider, and was immediately adopted into the center of things by Lottie, who seemed to run the social mechanics of the evening with the precision of a military operation disguised as hospitality. At one point, Grace stepped outside for air. The church had been heated to a degree that approached indecent, and stood in the snow looking up at the mountain. The sky was perfectly clear, and the stars were the extravagant kind that you only get at elevation, dense and blazing, and so numerous that the dark between them seemed incidental. She looked at the dark shape of the mountain against the star field and thought, without planning to, about a man sitting alone up there in a cabin on Christmas night. She went back inside and danced 2 reels with the Dunning father, whose name was Albert and who danced like a man who had learned by enthusiasm rather than instruction, and she laughed more than she had in months, and it was good. January was hard and honest. The cold came down from the higher peaks with a bluntness that did not apologize, and Grace's walks to school became an exercise in determination. She wore 2 pairs of wool stockings and her heaviest coat, and the scarf Elspeth had given her for Christmas, thick and green, and long enough to wrap twice. And she walked to the schoolhouse each morning with her breath steaming and her mind already on the day's lessons. On the 3rd Saturday of January she made bread, a good round loaf of white bread, dense and warm from the oven, with a crust the color of honey. She also wrapped a small portion of the dried fruit she had been given, apricots and plums, in a separate cloth. She walked to the flat rock. The rock was half buried in snow. She cleared it with her boot, set the bread and the dried fruit down, and stood for a moment in the stillness of the pine forest. It was remarkable quiet, the kind of quiet that is not empty but full, layered with the small sounds of winter, the distant percussion of a woodpecker, the soft collapse of snow from an upper branch, the sigh of wind moving through the high pines. She was about to turn and go when she heard, from somewhere up the road, the sound of horse hooves on packed snow. She stayed where she was, not because she meant to, but because the sound arrived before she could make a decision, and then it was too late to move without making her retreat obvious. Orville Keller came down the road on drum at a walk. He saw her immediately. She was standing in the middle of the road after all, and the horse slowed further, and then he stopped altogether, perhaps 10 feet from where she stood. They looked at each other. He was even larger than he had appeared in town, or perhaps it was the mountain setting that had rescaled her sense of proportion. He looked at her with eyes that were dark and careful, not hostile, precisely, but with the quality of an animal that is deciding whether the thing in front of it requires action or merely watchfulness. His beard had grown more in the weeks since she had seen him. His coat was the same one with the repaired tier. Grace said, "Good morning," because she was not capable of standing in front of another human being without acknowledging them, regardless of the circumstances. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You're the one leaving things on that rock." His voice was lower than she had expected, and rougher, like a road that had not been maintained but still went where it was supposed to go. "Yes," she said. "Why?" She considered lying or deflecting or giving a reasonable social answer. Then she decided against it. "Because I wanted to," she said. "Because I bake more than I need on Saturdays and it seems wrong to waste it." Because she paused, then decided to say the rest of it too, because I heard you had no use for kindness, and I thought that was sad, and leaving things on a rock did not seem to require your permission. He stared at her. It was a long stare, not aggressive but completely unguarded in its assessment of her, as if he had forgotten to put on the face that people usually wear in social situations. "It doesn't require my permission," he agreed. "I'm not asking you to stop." It was so unexpected, both what he said and the way he said it, which was careful and almost tentative, that Grace felt something loosen slightly in her chest. "Orville Keller," she said. "I'm Grace Sawyer. I teach school here." "I know," he said. He looked at the item she had placed on the rock, then he looked back at her. "That bread from 2 weeks ago," he said, and stopped. She waited. "It was good bread," he said, as if the words cost him something. "Thank you," she said simply, and did not make more of it than it was. He nodded once. Then he moved Drum forward and past her, continuing down the road toward town. She watched him go, the broad set of his shoulders, the horse moving with patient sureness through the snow, and then she turned and walked back to town herself in the opposite direction, and spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet that was entirely different from the quiet she usually kept. She did not tell Elspeth about the encounter, and this itself told her something. In February, she left things on the rock more consistently. Cornbread, a small jar of preserved peaches that Lottie had given her, a portion of the apple butter she made herself. Once, when she had been in a particularly industrious mood, a small paper packet of coffee that she had measured from her own supply, because she had noticed he bought coffee, and she thought coffee in the winter, when you are alone on a mountain, was one of the things that probably mattered more than you could explain to someone who had not been there. She began to look forward to Saturdays in a way that had nothing to do with the baking and everything to do with the walk. He was not always there. Most Saturdays she left her offering and turned back without seeing anyone. But twice in February he came down the road as she was setting things on the rock, and they spoke. Not for long, 5 minutes the first time, perhaps 8 the second. He asked her about the school. She told him about the children, the Dunning boys and their competitions, Rosalie's horses drawn in every margin, Peter and his astonishing reading. He listened with a quality of attention that was unusual. She had the feeling that he processed information differently from most people, more completely, perhaps, because he had so much more silence in which to process it. The second time, he told her that there had been a mountain lion in the lower forest, and that she should be careful when she walked there alone. He said it matter-of-factly, as a statement of relevant information, but she noticed that he waited until she had turned back toward the road home before he urged Drum forward, and she thought he was making sure she was moving in the right direction before he stopped watching. She thought about that for a very long time. March came with the first suggestions of thaw, not an actual thaw, not yet, but a softening in the mornings, a smell in the air that was different from winter's clean, cold blankness. A smell that had memory in it, something alive underneath the snow, beginning to consider its return. On the second Saturday of March, she arrived at the flat rock to find something on it. She stopped walking when she saw it, not from shock but from the desire to stand still and take in the fact of it before her mind moved forward. It was a piece of carved wood, small enough to fit in a palm, perhaps 4 inches long. It was a bird in flight, the wings spread, the body streamlined, carved from what she recognized as aspen wood with a precision and patience that spoke of long hours and considerable skill. It was not rough. It was beautiful in the particular way of handmade things that have had real time and care put into them. There was no note. There was no name. There was simply the bird, sitting on the flat rock in the pale March sunlight. Grace picked it up and held it. It was smooth as silk where the carving was finished, and she could see, in the wing joints, the careful attention that had been paid to making it exact. She stood in the pine forest for a long moment, holding the bird, looking at the mountain above her. She put the bird in her coat pocket and walked home. She set it on the windowsill next to the dried wildflowers that Elspeth had placed there on the day she arrived, and she stood looking at them both, the old flowers and the new bird, and felt something shift in the center of her chest that she was no longer going to pretend she could not name. Spring arrived gradually, in the way that springs arrive at elevation, not a sudden transformation but a slow negotiation between seasons, winter yielding a few feet at a time while spring pressed forward from the lower valleys. The snow pulled back from the roads. The aspens began their first tentative leafing. The sky changed from the deep Arctic blue of winter to something softer and more complicated, and Orville Keller began to come down the mountain more often. He came in March once and then twice more before the month was out. He came with no more explanation than he ever gave, bought his supplies from Harvey, said his few essential words and left. But each time he passed the school and Grace noticed, though she said nothing to anyone, that his route to and from the general store took him past the school even though it was not the most direct path. He would slow drum to a walk, and sometimes he would glance toward the building. And once, on a Thursday afternoon when the windows were open for the first time because the day had been warm enough, he paused entirely for a moment, and Grace, who was at the board writing out a reading passage, turned and saw him through the window and their eyes met, and he nodded once and rode on. She took her lunch hour on Fridays at the same flat stone now, walking up the lower road just to sit for a while in the pines. She brought her own food and ate it there. She left nothing on the rock these days. It had become, in some unspoken way, less of a delivery and more of a place. A meeting place, though it was not always a place where they met. On the first Friday of April, he was there when she arrived. Not on drum, which surprised her. He had walked down, apparently, which meant he had come specifically rather than being in transit. He was sitting on a fallen log near the flat rock, and he stood when he heard her coming, with a kind of automatic courtesy that sat oddly with the deliberate solitude he wore as his defining characteristic, as if the courtesy had been in him before the solitude and had not entirely been replaced. "I thought you might come on Fridays," he said. "I usually do," she said. She sat on the flat rock and he sat back on the log, and they were perhaps 6 feet apart, and the pine forest was full of birdsong that had been absent all winter and was now everywhere at once, riotous and declarative. "The bird you made," she said. "It is on my windowsill." He said nothing for a moment. "Then I make things in the winter, when there is nothing else." "You are very skilled." He looked down at his hands. "My father was a woodworker," he said. "I learned from watching him mostly. He did furniture. I do smaller things." He paused. "It is easier small things." Grace thought she understood that there was more than one meaning in what he said, and she chose not to press on it. They sat in the birdsong for a while. She ate her lunch cornbread and a hard-boiled egg, and he watched the trees. It was comfortable in a way that astonished her, because she could not think of any other person she had met in her life with whom silence could exist this way, not as an absence or a failure but as something present and mutual. "Your wife," she said, eventually. She said it quietly without preamble because she had decided that the only respectful way to approach it was directly, without the preamble of smaller questions. "I do not know what happened, and you do not have to tell me. But I wanted you to know that I know something happened, and that I am not afraid of it." She kept her eyes on the trees while she said it so he would not feel watched, so he could process it without an audience. The silence that followed was very long. "Her name was Clara," he said at last. "She died in the winter of 1872. She was 27. There was a child, a son, James. He was 2. He survived. He lives with Clara's sister in Laramie. A pause. I could not, he stopped, started again. I was not in a state to care for a child after. I was not a safe person for a child to be around. I was not safe for anyone to be around. I knew that about myself, so I came here. Grace turned and looked at him then. He was looking at his hands, which were clasped between his knees, and his expression had the quality of a man who has put something very heavy down and is not sure what he weighs without it. "How old is James now?" she asked. 8, he said. "He will be 9 in July. His aunt writes to me, I write back. He knows I am alive. He does not know me." A pause. "That is my fault." "Yes," Grace said, because she would not insult him by disagreeing with something she could not actually assess. "But fault is not the same as permanent condition." He looked at her then, sharply, as if she had said something that required reassessment. She met his gaze without looking away. His eyes were dark brown. She saw now not black as she had thought, but the deep brown of creek water over dark stones, and there was in them a depth that came from years of having nobody to show it to. "You are a strange woman," he said. "I have been told that," she agreed. Something happened in his face then that she had not seen before, a brief, startled movement that was, she realized with something like wonder, the very earliest beginning of a smile. It did not complete itself, but it had been there, unfinished and unprecedented, and she felt it in her chest like the first note of a song you have been waiting to hear. He came to the flat rock on the following Friday. And the Friday after that. April became May, and the mountains opened up in the way that alpine springs do, suddenly, emphatically, as if apologizing for the long winter by over-delivering on color. The lower meadows filled with wild columbines in blue and white, and the higher slopes ran with snowmelt that fed every creek in the territory. The air smelled of green things growing, of earth released from cold, of possibility. Their conversations deepened in the way that creek beds deepen, gradually, by the constant, patient motion of water. He told her about Wyoming, where he had grown up, the son of a German immigrant woodworker who had come to America with a set of chisels and an extraordinary stubbornness. He told her about meeting Clara at a church social in Cheyenne when he was 23, how she had laughed at something he said, a dry, quiet observation about the minister's hat, and how he had never in his life felt so instantly, perfectly known as he did in that moment of shared amusement. He told her about building their small house outside Cheyenne, about learning to trap and hunt because he had needed to learn something that was his own and not inherited. About James being born in the July heat, small and red-faced and furious, the most astonishing thing Orville had ever seen. Grace listened to all of it without flinching. She told him about her own life too, about her father, who had been a deeply good man of strong convictions and very poor financial instincts, who had loved her enormously and left her nothing except herself. About her mother, who had died when Grace was 14, and who had been the kind of woman who was so genuinely, fully present in every room she entered that her absence afterward felt like a structural removal, like pulling a load-bearing wall. About Pueblo and the Sunday school children and the slow, deliberate decision to answer an advertisement and go somewhere entirely new. "Were you afraid?" he asked her once. "Of coming here?" she said. "Yes, but I have found that being afraid of a thing and doing it anyway tends to work out better than not doing it. The fear does not go away, but you stop minding it as much." He thought about that for a moment. "I was afraid of coming here," he said. "I was afraid of not coming here. I was afraid of everything after Clara. I was not afraid when she was alive. She was—" He stopped, tried again. "She made bravery feel natural somehow. After she was gone, I realized I had been borrowing it from her." "You are braver than you think," Grace said quietly. "Coming here was brave. Staying was brave, even if it did not feel that way." "It felt like hiding," he said honestly. "Hiding takes courage too, sometimes," she said, "when you are protecting yourself from something that genuinely would have destroyed you." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had learned to read by now, not because she had cracked some code, but because she had spent enough time with him that the language of his face had become, if not fluent, at least comprehensible to her. It was an expression that meant he was taking something in and deciding whether to believe it. "Why do you keep coming here?" he asked. It was not an unfriendly question, it was a real one. "Because I want to," she said, as she had said the first time. Then because they had traveled far enough together now that she could say more. "Because I find you," she paused, choosing, "remarkable, in a way that I did not expect and cannot seem to put down. Because I look forward to Fridays in a way that has nothing to do with the pine trees, and I think you probably know that." He was very still. She kept going, because she had started and stopping seemed dishonest. "I am not asking anything of you," she said. "I am not demanding that you be someone you are not or that you have things you do not have. I am only saying the truth because I have found that the truth, even when it is complicated, is easier to carry than its absence." He stood up from the log. He walked the 6 feet between the log and the flat rock and stood perhaps 2 feet in front of her, looking down at her from his full height, and she looked up at him without retreating, and the May afternoon air moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. "I do not know how to do this anymore," he said. "I used to know. I had a life and I had a person in it and I knew how to do it. Now I do not." "You are already doing it," she said. "You have been doing it every Friday for a month." Another one of those unfinished smiles, but it was closer to finishing this time. She could see the shape of what it would be when it finally completed itself. "I carved you something else," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small object. A fox, this one sitting, its tail curled around its feet, its ears alert. The same aspen wood, the same extraordinary care. He held it out to her. She took it. Their fingers did not quite touch, but the almost was its own thing. "Thank you," she said. "You can put it with the bird," he said, and the way he said it with the particular shy precision of someone who has imagined exactly where it will sit undid her completely. "I will," she said, and smiled at him fully without reserve, the way she had not smiled at anyone since long before her father died. He did not smile back, not quite yet, but he did not look away. Summer arrived with the generous warmth of a Colorado mountain summer, which is a different quality of warmth from any other high and clear and vivid. The blue of the sky so absolute that it seems painted on. Grace's school recessed in June, as the children were needed for various summer tasks on farms and ranches, and she found herself with more time than she had had all year. She read. She gardened. She helped Elspeth with various projects, repainting the fence around the church, organizing the small lending library that the town maintained in the back room of the general store. And she saw Orville more. He began to come down the mountain more frequently once the passes were fully open, once a week sometimes, then twice. He stopped at the general store as always, and now he also stopped at Grace's house. Not every time, but with increasing regularity. He would knock, he always knocked, with a knock that had a quality of apology in it, as if he were still not entirely certain he had the right to knock, and she would open the door and he would be standing there with something. A rabbit he had caught, once, cleaned and ready for the pot. A bundle of wildflowers another time, held out with an expression of such determined nonchalance that she had to work very hard not to smile too broadly. Once, a paper carefully folded around a letter he had written, which he placed in her hand, and then stepped back from as if he were afraid of it. She read that letter at her kitchen table after he had gone, and it was the most painstaking and careful thing she had ever read, not eloquent in the way that practiced writers are eloquent, but precise and deeply felt, in the way of someone who has chosen every word because every word needed to be right. He had written about James. About wanting, when spring had become summer, to write to James's aunt and ask if the boy might come to Harlan's Creek for a visit, not immediately, not to upend everything, but someday. As a beginning, he had written, "I think I am beginning to believe again that beginning something is possible. I am not certain of the reason for that, but I thought you should know." She folded that letter and placed it in the tin box where she kept her important things: the portrait of her parents, the letter of recommendation from her minister in Pueblo, the small carved bird and fox she had moved inside from the windowsill because she worried about the weather getting to them. She placed the letter in there with those things, and the decision of where to put it told her everything she needed to know about what it meant to her. July was warm and golden, and she turned 27, and Elspeth threw a small supper in her honor, and Orville came. She had not invited him. She had mentioned it casually, in the same tone she used to mention any piece of information, and had then deliberately not said anything more about it, because she would not presume. But he came, and he sat at Elspeth's table with the careful stillness of someone in a social situation who is working harder than he is making apparent, and he ate 2 plates of food and said 12 or 13 whole sentences to various people, and did not flee before the evening ended. When they walked back to Grace's house afterward, because he had walked her home another first without discussion, they stood on her porch in the warm July night, and the stars were out in their full magnificence, and he looked at her in the way he had been looking at her for weeks now, which was the way that you look at something you are afraid to reach for. "James," he said, "I wrote to his aunt, Martha. I asked if he might come in August just for a week, to meet me. She has agreed if he is willing." Grace felt joy move through her so suddenly and completely that it took an actual physical effort to maintain composure. "Orville," she said, that is one of the bravest things." "I don't know how he will receive me," he said. "I don't know that he should, that I deserve to be received well. He is 8 years old," she said. 8-year-old boys do not think in terms of desert. They think in terms of whether you are interesting and whether you seem glad to see them." "I will be very glad to see him," Orville said, and the simple honesty of it was almost more than she could stand. She reached out and put her hand on his arm over the sleeve of his coat. She had not touched him before, not since the almost touching when he handed her the fox. She felt the solidity of his arm under her hand, and she felt him go very still in the way of someone who is trying very hard not to startle. "He will be glad too," she said. "In time." He looked down at her hand on his arm. Then he raised his eyes to hers, and the thing that was in them now was not the careful watchfulness of the man on the horse in November, or the raw pain of someone putting down heavy grief in the spring. It was something else, open and frightened and full, the expression of a man standing at the edge of something vast and choosing, deliberately and with full knowledge of the cost, to step forward. "Grace," he said, just her name. But in his voice it had the quality of an entire declaration. "Yes," she said quietly, though he had not yet asked anything. He put his large, rough hand over hers where it rested on his arm, and they stood like that on the porch in the July night for a very long time, and it was everything. James Keller arrived in Harlan's Creek on the 11th of August on the southbound stage from Denver, where he had traveled with his Aunt Martha from Laramie. He was 8 years old, slight for his age, with hair the color of dark straw and an expression of careful watchfulness that Grace recognized immediately as inherited. He held a cloth bag with his belongings and looked at the town with the assessment of a child who has been told something large is going to happen and is gathering information before committing to an opinion. Orville was at the stage depot when it arrived. Grace was there too, not because she had been asked exactly, but because Orville had mentioned the day and time with a quality of strained nerves that made her determination to be nearby on that day non-negotiable. She stood back far enough to give them space. When James stepped off the stage and saw his father, and he clearly knew his father, perhaps from a daguerreotype, because he looked directly at Orville and stopped moving, there was a long, charged moment. Orville crouched down so he was at the boy's level, which cost him physically because he was a very large man and the crouching was ungainly, but he did it. "James," he said. James looked at him. "Father," he said in a voice that was working very hard to be neutral. Orville said, "I am very glad you came." I know it took courage." James looked at him with those watchful inherited eyes. "Aunt Martha says you live on a mountain," he said. "I do. Does it have bears?" "It does." James considered this for a moment with the gravity of a small scholar. "All right," he said, and picked up his bag again. Orville rose from his crouch, and Grace saw on his face she was far enough away that she could observe without being observed, an expression that broke her heart open in the best possible way. It was relief and love and terrible hope, all at once, on a face that had spent 6 years learning not to show any of those things. The week of James's visit was, Grace thought afterward, one of the most extraordinary weeks she had witnessed in her life. Father and son moved around each other with the careful tentative attention of two people negotiating the grammar of a relationship neither of them had yet learned to speak. Orville showed James how to identify animal tracks in the mud along the creek. James showed Orville, with great solemnity, a card trick that Aunt Martha's husband had taught him. Orville made breakfast each morning with a concentration that spoke of someone who had been practicing what to cook for an 8-year-old. And James ate everything without complaint and once said, entirely without guile, that the flapjacks were the best he had ever had. And Orville looked at the pan and said, with studious casualness, that he had had good instruction. Grace had given the instruction one afternoon at her kitchen table, the two of them, Orville watching her technique with the focused attention he brought to everything, and she had pretended not to notice the compliment. On the last evening of James's visit, he came to find Grace at her house. He knocked on her door alone without his father, and she opened it to find him standing on her porch with an expression of unusual resolution for a small boy. "Miss Sawyer," he said, "my father talks about you." Grace crouched down so she was at his level because that seemed right. "Does he?" she said. "Not directly," James said, with the precision of a child who has learned to notice what adults do not say, "but in the way where you can tell. He said you baked things and left them on the road, even when he told people he did not want anything. That was you." "That was me," Grace said. James thought about this. Then, "Why?" "Because I thought it was important," she said. "And because sometimes you have to do the thing that matters to you even when you are not sure how it will be received." James nodded with great seriousness. "He is not as alone as he was," the boy said. "Aunt Martha will be pleased." Then he turned and went back down the porch steps with the matter-of-fact air of a child who had completed a necessary investigation and obtained satisfactory results. And Grace stood in her doorway watching him go, and felt something in her chest that was too large for the body trying to contain it. James went back to Laramie the following morning, and Orville watched the stage go with an expression that made the quality of the loss entirely legible. But he also had, around the edges of it, something that had not been there before, something that looked, unmistakably, like determination, like a man who has located something he intends to pursue. He came to find Grace that afternoon. She was in her small garden, doing the last of the summer weeding before the autumn cold made it irrelevant. She heard him at the gate and turned. He stood there with his hat in his hands, which she had never seen before, him holding his hat rather than wearing it, and it made him look somehow both more and less formidable, and he said, "I would like to court you properly, if that is something you would want. I am aware that I am difficult. I am aware that I have years of habits that are not conducive to what you would deserve, but I would like to try if you'll have me try." Grace stood up from her kneeling and pulled off her gardening gloves and looked at him. She thought about the cake on the flat rock in December, the bird on her windowsill, the Fridays in the pine forest, the hand on the porch in July. She thought about how much distance they had already traveled, the two of them, and how different the starting point seemed from here. "Orville," she said, "you have been courting me since January, and you have been doing it beautifully." The smile finished completing itself then. She had been waiting for it since April, since she had seen the unfinished shape of it begin, and it was worth every week of waiting. It transformed his entire face, not into someone unrecognizable, but into a fuller version of him, someone whose depths were the same but whose surface was no longer sealed. It was a real smile, warm and slightly astonished, the smile of someone who has been given something they had stopped expecting. "I suppose I have," he said. She crossed the garden and went through the gate and stood in front of him. He was so much taller than her that she had to look up. She had grown accustomed to looking up, and she found she did not mind it at all. "Yes," she said. "I would like you to court me properly." He put his hat back on. Then, with a deliberateness that was entirely characteristic of him, that quality of thinking through each action before committing to it, he offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked down the main road of Harlan's Creek together in the August afternoon. Elspeth saw them from her front porch and said nothing, which was the most expressive thing she had ever not said. The autumn of 1879 was the finest season Grace had ever known in her life, and she had known some fine seasons. The aspens went gold again, and the mountain put on its October theater, and the school year resumed, and Grace taught her 12 children with a new energy that she recognized as happiness, not the careful, provisional happiness she had been maintaining since her father's death, but the real kind, the kind that has something to stand on. Orville came into town twice a week now, without fail. He sat at Grace's kitchen table on Tuesday evenings, and they cooked together and talked, and she had come to understand that cooking together was, for him, the most natural form of conversation. The activity gave his hands something to do, and released his voice from the pressure of being the only thing in action. He told her things at the stove that she suspected he had never told anyone else. Small things, sometimes. The name of a dog he had had as a boy in Wyoming. The smell of his mother's kitchen at Christmas. The particular sound Clara had made when she was reading something she found funny, a small, private sound, a sound meant for no one that he had loved. Grace listened to all of it and did not treat the mention of Clara as a wound to be careful around. Clara had been real and was still real, and Orville's love for her had been real, and Grace found that she could hold that fact, could hold the whole truth of it, including the loss and the grief and the years on the mountain, without feeling diminished by it. You did not diminish yourself by making room for the full truth of another person's life. She wrote to Aunt Martha. She introduced herself, explained who she was, said that she was not trying to replace anyone or insert herself where she did not belong, but that she cared deeply about James's father and was therefore concerned about James as a matter of course. Martha's reply came 3 weeks later, written in a hand that was neat and decisive, and it said, among other things, "He sounds like a different man from the letters he has been sending these past months, and whatever you have done or are doing, I am grateful. James has started asking if he might visit again." Grace showed that letter to Orville. He read it at her kitchen table and then set it down and did not say anything for a while, and she let the silence be what it was, which was a man absorbing the first evidence that the person he had been becoming might actually be visible to others. "I want him to come for Christmas," Orville said at last. "If Martha will bring him, if—" he looked at Grace carefully, "if that would be acceptable to you." "It would be the best Christmas I can imagine," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. He had been reaching for her more in recent weeks, not dramatically, not with any theatrical demonstration of feeling, but in the particular way of someone rediscovering that physical contact with another person you love is not a danger. Gentle, deliberate contact that said, "Each time I am choosing this. I know what I am doing. I want to." She held his hand and felt the familiar roughness of his palm and the warmth of him and thought, "This is what it is to be found after you had stopped looking." He kissed her for the first time on a Thursday evening in late October, on her porch, with the October wind moving down from the mountain and the smell of coming snow in the air. He had been leaving after their Tuesday transition to Thursday supper, which had happened because one Tuesday she was unwell, and he had rearranged without discussion, and she had made a note of the fact that it never went back to Tuesday, because Thursday had apparently been enough of an improvement to make permanent. He stopped at the top of the porch steps, the place where they always paused before the goodbye that concluded these evenings, and he turned back to her. He looked at her for a long moment with that complete, unguarded attention that was particular to him, the kind of looking that made you feel entirely seen and did not make you want to hide. "Grace," he said. "Yes," she said again, as she had on the night in July. He leaned down and kissed her with the same quality of deliberateness that characterized everything he did, thought through, committed to, real. His beard was soft against her face, and his hands came up to hold her face so gently that it made her chest ache. It was not a short kiss. It was a kiss that had 6 months of carefully accumulated feeling behind it. And it was the kind of kiss you remember not just in your memory, but in your body, in the whole architecture of yourself. When he stepped back, he was looking at her with an expression she had no precedent for reading, because it was entirely new to his face, unguarded and lit from somewhere deep. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said things that cost him, directly and without elaboration, because elaboration would have required a kind of control he did not currently have. "I did not expect to say that to anyone again. I had decided I was done with it, with the whole of it. I want you to know that, so you understand what it means that I am saying it." "I know what it means," she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her because the rest of her was not. "I love you too, Orville. I have for some time." "How long?" he asked with a curiosity that was almost shy. She thought about the carved bird. "Since April," she said, "at least. Perhaps earlier, if I am being fully honest." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a breath, the first genuine laugh-adjacent sound she had heard from him, and it was low and warm, and it filled the October air like something that had been absent for too long. "Since January," he said, with a certainty that surprised her. "Since you were standing in the road in the snow with the bread, and you said you left it because you wanted to and did not require my permission. I did not know what to do with you at all." She laughed. "Properly, openly, not at all carefully. And now," he said, "I know exactly what to do with you. I want to marry you." Grace stared at him. He had not led up to it, had not approached it with the usual incremental preparations, and then she thought, "Who am I surprised? This is exactly who he is. When he decides, he says." "Orville," she said. "You don't have to." "I am going to say yes," she said. I needed a moment to actually have this moment before I moved through it." He waited. His expression was carefully still, but his hands were not. They were very slightly not still, and she had learned to read that. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." The carefully still expression broke open completely. She watched it happen and felt it happen in herself simultaneously. And it was one of those moments that you know, even while you are inside it, that you will carry forever, intact and vivid, for the rest of your life. He embraced her then, wrapped those large arms around her, and held her with the kind of force that is not aggressive but is urgent. The force of someone who has been keeping themselves at distance for a very long time and has been given permission to stop. She pressed her face against his chest and felt the solid reality of him and closed her eyes. "We will need to write to Martha," she said, her voice somewhat muffled by his coat. "About Christmas and about everything." "Yes," he said. His voice above her head was rough with feeling. "We will." The wedding was planned for the spring. December came first, and with it came James and Aunt Martha, arriving on the stage 2 days before Christmas Eve with the contained excitement of travelers who know they are headed somewhere good. James was taller than he had been in August, as 8-year-olds tend to be when you look at them, with several months between viewings. And he had lost 2 teeth since the last visit, which he displayed immediately and with great pride. Aunt Martha was a woman of perhaps 50, compact and alert, with the eyes of someone who had been managing the consequences of other people's grief for a long time without losing her warmth. She shook Grace's hand with both of hers and held the handshake for a moment longer than strictly necessary, which said everything she apparently needed to say without saying it. James told his father about school in Laramie with a confidence he had not had in August, more willing, now, to fill the space between them with ordinary information, less guarded about whether the information would be welcome. Orville received it all with visible gladness, asking follow-up questions that James answered with increasing animation, and by the second day, the two of them were building something together in Orville's rented room at the boarding house. Orville had declined to descend from the mountain without a place in town for his family, which Grace thought was as clear a statement of intention as any she had heard. Something small and mechanical, a little puzzle box that Orville had brought down from the cabin. On Christmas morning, Grace woke very early and went to her kitchen and baked. She made the spiced apple cake that she had made on the first December Saturday when she had decided to leave something on a flat rock on the mountain road, a decision that had changed everything, though she had not known it then. The kitchen filled with the smell of cinnamon and vanilla and warmth, and she stood in the middle of it and thought about the woman she had been 11 months ago, stepping off a stagecoach with a carpet bag and a tin pot, and felt a gratitude so profound it was almost physical. The Christmas gathering at Elspeth's house that evening included the whole Harrow table extended with a borrowed plank, and Elspeth had cooked enough for twice as many people as were there, which was standard. Harvey and Lottie came. The Dunning family came, all of them, and Colt and Reuben Dunning took one look at James and immediately assessed him as a potential ally, which James seemed to regard as promising. Albert Dunning had brought his fiddle, and after supper he played and Elspeth sang, a strong, clear voice, entirely unself-conscious, and James watched with enormous eyes and the expression of someone adding significant data to their understanding of what the world contains. Orville sat beside Grace at the table, and his knee pressed against hers in that unspoken way that people in love conduct their private conversation in the middle of public ones, and she pressed back. After supper, when James and the Dunning boys had been corralled into a corner with a checkerboard, and Aunt Martha was deep in conversation with Elspeth about some comparative cookery that seemed to be generating strong opinions on both sides, Orville leaned down close to Grace's ear. "Next Christmas," he said quietly, "I would like us all to be together properly, as a family." She turned her face up toward his. "Then let us get married before next Christmas," she said. "April," he said. "May at the latest." "April," she agreed. They were married on the 22nd of April, 1880, in the small church in Harlan's Creek with the crooked steeple. The Reverend was a measured man named Aldrich who performed the ceremony with a simplicity that suited both of them. Elspeth stood beside Grace. Harvey stood beside Orville, who had told him 3 weeks before the wedding that he was the closest thing Orville had to a friend in this town, and Harvey had nodded and said he reckoned he could live with that, and that was as ceremonial as the arrangement got. James stood in the front pew next to Aunt Martha, wearing a shirt that had clearly been pressed with unusual care, and when Reverend Aldrich asked if there was any reason these two should not be joined, James said, in a carrying whisper to his aunt, "There isn't, is there?" And Martha patted his hand and said there certainly was not, and both Orville and Grace heard this perfectly well, and neither of them could speak for a moment for the smiling. Grace had made her own dress ivory cotton with a small embroidered edge at the collar and cuffs, the embroidery done in the winter evenings when the school days were done, and she had the quiet of her small house and her needle and her certainty. She had embroidered small birds along the collar edge, aspenwood colored in her imagining, because she knew what they meant and wanted them there. Orville had, at her insistence, acquired a proper coat for the occasion, dark wool, new, and had allowed Elspeth to supervise the trimming of his beard to a state that was dignified without abandoning its character, which Elspeth had done with the decisive competence she brought to everything. When Reverend Aldrich said the words that joined them, Orville looked at Grace with an openness so total that she thought she could see straight through to the bottom of him, to everything that was there, the grief and the years on the mountain and the carved birds and the bread on the flat rock and the first unfinished smile in April, and James with his missing teeth in December, and all of it, arriving at this point. "I do," he said, in a voice that came from so deep in his chest that she felt it as much as heard it. They moved into Orville's cabin that summer, a decision that had required some negotiation, because Grace had her school to consider. The resolution was that Orville would build a proper road improvement to the lower section of the mountain path, a project that he and Harvey and Albert Dunning undertook with picks and shovels over 3 weekends in May, so that Grace could make the descent to town in the morning and the ascent back in the evening without it being the ordeal it had previously been. A horse helped. Orville procured a second horse for her, a steady gray mare named Pearl, who had the character of a sensible aunt, and the daily ride became one of the pleasures of Grace's life rather than an obstacle. The cabin itself she found she loved more than she had expected. It was larger than she had imagined from the outside. Orville had added to it in the years he had been there, a back room and a loft, built with the same painstaking care he applied to everything. The walls were full of his carvings, which she had not known until she arrived, not just small animals but larger pieces, furniture and frames, and a rocking chair by the hearth that was the most beautiful practical object she had ever seen. She stood in the middle of his home and turned slowly and took in the evidence of 6 years of solitude transformed, piece by piece, into art, and she felt the history of the place like a physical thing. "You should sell some of these," she said. He looked around as if he had never considered it. "They're just things I made." "They are extraordinary," she said. "Harvey would know if there is a market. People in Denver would pay very well for work like this." He thought about it. He was silent in the way of someone genuinely considering a thing rather than dismissing it. "Perhaps," he said, "Harvey did know." There was indeed a market, and the first time Orville sent a set of 6 carved pieces to a shop in Denver that Harvey knew of. The reply came back 3 weeks later with money that was enough to purchase 6 months of supplies and a request for more. Orville read the letter twice and then set it down and stared at the wall. "Well," he said. "Well," Grace agreed, smiling. James came for a full month in the summer of 1880, and it was a different visit from all the previous ones. Not the cautious negotiations of strangers, but the genuine, sometimes chaotic warmth of people who are learning to be family. He ran wild on the mountain with an energy that suggested Laramie had not been providing adequate terrain for the full expression of his nature. He helped Orville in the workshop with fierce concentration, and some excellent whittling for an 8-year-old turning 9, that July with a party that Grace organized with materials brought up from town. A proper cake with candles, a new knife for carving, a book that she had selected with the care of someone who had assessed his reading level over the winter's correspondence. He blew out his candles with the gusty determination of a child who has a specific wish and is not leaving it to chance. Grace did not ask what he wished, but that night when Orville came to bed and lay in the dark beside her, he said, "He asked if he could call you Mama Grace." She lay very still. "I told him that was something you would have to decide," Orville continued, "that it was a large word and deserved your consideration." "What did he say to that?" "He said he had already considered it and the answer was obvious, but he was being polite." A pause. "He is 8. 9, Grace corrected, her voice not entirely steady. 9, Orville agreed. "What would you like to tell him?" "I would like to tell him yes," she said. "I would like to tell him that it would make me very happy." Orville took her hand in the dark. "Good," he said. "She found out in August that she was expecting a child." She told Orville on a Tuesday evening, not a Thursday, which had become their formal supper night, but a Tuesday, which felt more like ordinary life, which is what this news was part of. Ordinary, extraordinary life, standing in their kitchen with the August sun coming through the window and her hands braced on the table, and her heart going very fast. He went entirely still the way he went still when he was taking something enormous in. She watched him. Then he came around the table to her and he gathered her in, very carefully, as if she had become something that needed the most particular handling, and held her against his chest, and she felt him shaking slightly, just slightly, the movement of a feeling too large for the body to contain without some physical expression. "Grace," he said, "just that." "Are you glad?" she asked, though she could feel the answer in the way he held her. "Yes," he said. "I am, I cannot, yes." The baby arrived in the early weeks of April 1881, almost exactly a year after their wedding, in the early morning hours when the mountain was just beginning to show its first gray light. The midwife from town, a formidable woman named Mrs. Packard, had been staying in the cabin for 2 days in anticipation, and Orville spent those hours in the alternating grip of uselessness and terror that is the particular province of prospective fathers, doing things with his hands in the workshop because the alternative was pacing. When Mrs. Packard called him in, he came through the door with his hat in his hands again. That hat-in-hands posture that Grace had come to understand meant he was afraid of something he cared about very much, and stood at the bedside and looked at her, and then looked at the small, rapt, emphatically vocal person in her arms. "A son," Grace said. She was exhausted and radiant in the way of people who have just done the most difficult and important thing of their lives. Orville sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. The baby was red-faced and indignant and blinking at the light with the expression of someone who has significant opinions about the transition they have just been required to make. He was perfect. "What shall we call him?" Grace asked. Orville reached out and put one careful finger against the baby's hand, and the baby grabbed it with the automatic grip of the newborn, and Orville looked at that tiny hand around his finger and did not speak for a long moment. "Henry," he said. "After my father." "Henry," she agreed. James came to meet Henry in June, arriving from Laramie with Aunt Martha and a gift he had selected himself, a small carved horse, not as fine as his father's work but earnest and recognizable as a horse, made over the winter in deliberate imitation of Orville's technique. He presented it to his baby brother with the solemnity of someone making a significant presentation, and then stood over the cradle looking down with an expression Grace recognized as the beginning of an older sibling's complicated love. "He is very small," James said. "He will grow," Orville said. "I know," James said. He poked Henry's hand gently with one finger, and Henry grabbed it, and James looked up at his father with an expression of startled joy. "He grabbed me." "He does that," Orville said. James stood there letting the baby hold his finger, and his face was open in the way that children's faces are when something lands in them that they did not know to expect. In the summer of 1882, Aunt Martha wrote with carefully chosen words to say that James, who was now 10, had been asking with increasing frequency whether he might come to live in Harlan's Creek, that he missed his father and missed Grace and had met Henry now twice and wanted to know his brother, that Martha and her husband would support whatever was decided, though they would of course miss him enormously, that they thought it was right to say what the boy wanted. Orville read that letter at the kitchen table while Grace nursed Henry, now over a year old and with opinions about everything, a baby of particular character, and she watched Orville's face and saw him working through it. "What do you want?" she asked him. "I want my son," he said. It was simple and declarative and entirely unguarded. "Then write to Martha," she said. He did. The negotiations were gentle and extended, and everyone involved was motivated by what was genuinely best for James, which made it easier. James came to Harlan's Creek in September of 1882 to live, with Aunt Martha's blessing and a promise that she would visit every summer and that James could return to Laramie whenever he wished. He enrolled in Grace's school, which had grown to 15 children now, the town having drawn in a few more families over the 2 years, and Grace taught him alongside the others with the particular mixture of professional impartiality and invisible partiality that mothers have always managed in such situations. He was a quick student, reading above his grade level, which surprised no one who knew his father. He rode Pearl to school each morning. Grace rode Drum now, because Pearl was more even-tempered under uncertain conditions, and Grace was expecting again. And the sight of the 11-year-old boy on the reliable gray mare, his lunch pail hanging from one hand, became a fixed piece of the landscape of Harlan's Creek's mornings. The second child, born in the February of 1883, was a girl. They named her Clara, and the naming was Grace's suggestion, and Orville had gone entirely still again when she made it. In the way of someone absorbing something, they had not allowed themselves to hope for the acknowledgement that his grief was real, that his first love was real, that making room for both the past and the present was not only possible but the fullest way to live. "Grace," he said, in the voice he used when something was beyond him. "She should have a name that matters," Grace said simply. "Clara is a name that matters." Little Clara was, as it turned out, a person of substantial personal authority from approximately the second week of her existence. She had her father's watchful quality and her mother's complete absence of hesitation about stating her views, and the combination produced a child who, by the age of 1, was communicating her requirements and preferences with a clarity that consistently astonished visitors. James regarded her with a mixture of awe and wariness that Grace found deeply amusing. Henry, who was 2, regarded her as competition for certain preferred objects and responded by hiding his best toys, which Grace pretended not to notice. Orville's carvings sold consistently in Denver, and word of his work had reached as far as Santa Fe, where a merchant had written to inquire about larger furniture pieces. He had built a proper workshop on the side of the cabin by now, with better light and a good chimney for the cold months, and he spent the hours when Grace was at school, and the children were occupied in a state of focused creative contentment that she recognized as his particular form of happiness: the deep, non-verbal engagement with making things. She would come home in the late afternoon and find him in the workshop, usually, and she would stand in the doorway for a moment before speaking just to watch him work, because there was something in it that she never tired of seeing. The man who had said he had no use for anything, making things of extraordinary beauty, making them for a life he had chosen to come back to. He always knew she was there. He would set down whatever he was working on and turn to her with the particular quality of attention that was entirely hers, not performed, never performed, but real, the full presence of a man who had learned or relearned that the person in the doorway was the thing worth looking at. "Good day," he would ask. "Good day," she would say, and mean it. By the autumn of 1883, the flat rock on the lower mountain road had become something of a landmark for the community. Children from town sometimes left small objects there. It had taken on, in the way that places take on meaning through accumulated use, the quality of a spot where things could be offered and received. Nobody had made a formal declaration of this. It had simply evolved in the way that meaningful places do. One October afternoon, coming home from school on Drum while James rode ahead on Pearl, and the 2 younger children were up at the cabin with Mrs. Packard, who came 3 times a week to help, Grace paused at the flat rock. She had not paused there intentionally in a long time. She dismounted and stood in the familiar pine forest with the familiar smell of pine resin and cold air and something alive underneath, and she stood for a long moment looking at the rock. She thought about the woman who had stood here 5 years ago with a wrapped cake and a determination that had no guarantee of success and no certainty of anything except the correctness of the impulse. She thought about the sound of horse hooves on packed snow and a large man on a dark bay horse, stopping, looking at her with the careful dark eyes of someone who had shut himself away and could not quite account for why he was stopping. "You're the one leaving things on that rock." "Yes." "Why?" "Because I wanted to." She took a breath of the October air and felt it fill her completely. Orville came down the road then on Drum's predecessor. They had gotten a new horse named Buck that spring, now that Drum was getting old and he was coming from above, which meant he had ridden out to meet her as he sometimes did on the late afternoons. He stopped when he saw her standing by the flat rock and swung down from Buck and came to stand beside her. He looked at the rock, then at her. Remembering, he asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Every time I pass it," he said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I am glad you left the cake," she laughed. "You ate every bit of it." "I did," he said without embarrassment. "It was the best cake I had ever eaten." "It was a perfectly ordinary cake," she said. "Nothing you have ever done in your life has been perfectly ordinary," he said, with a conviction that made further argument impossible. She looked at him. This man she had found, or who had found her, or both, this large, careful, deep-natured man who had been on a mountain trying not to exist and was now, in every particular of his face and posture, someone who was exactly where he intended to be. "Come home," she said. "Yes," he said. They rode home together in the October afternoon, up the improved road through the pines, toward the cabin where Henry and Clara were, and where James would come back to from town when school let out, and where the workshop was full of beautiful things being made, and where the fire in the hearth was laid and ready to be lit, and where the windowsill had two carved figures on it, a bird and a fox, moved from Grace's house in town when she moved to the mountain, placed on the sill of this new house where they remained. Orville lit the fire that evening while Grace cooked, the two of them moving around each other in the kitchen with the practiced ease of people who have learned each other's rhythms so thoroughly that they are almost unconscious. James came in from town with cold cheeks and the news that Colt Dunning had won the spelling contest, but only by a very small margin, and that the result was disputed by Reuben, who had strong opinions about the word in question. Henry, who had been napping, woke and demanded to know where everyone was and received the full census of the household with satisfaction before requesting dinner with the command of a small emperor. Clara, carried in by Mrs. Packard before she left for the evening, regarded the kitchen with the analytical eyes of a baby who is conducting an ongoing survey of the territory. At the table, with the fire going and the food on, and the family arranged around it in the casual constellation that families make when they are settled into each other, Grace looked around at all of them. James cutting his food with the concentration of a 10-year-old who has been reminded to use his manners. Henry eating with the wholehearted commitment of a 2-year-old for whom meals are among life's primary pleasures. Clara installed in Orville's arms because she had decided she required his immediate attention and had communicated this with authority and felt the completeness of it. Not a perfect completeness. Nothing was perfect. There were hard days and cold days and days when the mountain was unforgiving and days when the old grief surfaced in Orville's eyes in a way that reminded her that you did not resolve these things so much as you learned to carry them differently, with better hands and more people to help. There were days when she was tired down to her bones, and when the distance from town felt too great, and when the children needed more than one person could give in any single moment. But it was complete in the way that real things are complete, not in the absence of difficulty, but in the presence of enough love to make difficulty livable. In the roundness of it, the ongoing nature of it, the fact that every morning she woke up in this life that had been built piece by piece out of a cake left on a rock and a carved bird and Fridays in the pine forest, and a man who had thought he was done with everything, but had not quite been able to be. She reached across the table and put her hand over Orville's where it rested beside his plate, and he turned his hand and held hers, and looked at her with those dark eyes that she could read now like her own name. "Good?" he asked, quietly, under the noise of the children. "Good," she said. The years settled into them with the comfortable weight of a life properly inhabited. James grew into a young man of quiet intelligence and Orville's same quality of stillness, with Grace's humor layered in underneath. And at 16, he was already being talked about by Harvey as a natural candidate to take over the store someday, which James received with characteristic thoughtfulness. Neither dismissal nor immediate agreement, but the expression of someone genuinely considering. He wrote to Aunt Martha twice a month without fail and visited Laramie every second summer, and Martha came to Harlan's Creek every summer without fail, and she and Elspeth had by now developed a friendship of such mutual esteem and competitive cookery that it had become one of the defining pleasures of the seasonal calendar for both women. Henry, at 5 and then 6 and then 7, was everything that 4-year-old Colt Dunning had been, all energy and enthusiasm, and the unshakable conviction that any idea he had was a good one. And he was also completely himself, with his mother's willingness to walk toward difficult things, and his father's capacity for sustained concentration once something had captured him. He decided at age 6 that he was going to learn to carve like his father, and Orville taught him with a patience so complete that Grace sometimes stood in the workshop doorway watching and thought, he could have been a teacher. He has always been a teacher. He just had no students until now. Clara, who turned 4 and then 5, was a person of such definite character that her parents had taken to occasionally exchanging the same glance across the supper table, the glance of people confronted with a force of nature they had created and remain, despite everything, amazed by. She wanted to read everything. She wanted to know how everything worked. She put questions to adults with a directness that most adults found startling, and that Grace recognized as exactly herself, at that age, in a family that had occasionally found it inconvenient. "She is going to be something," Orville said one evening, watching Clara disassemble a pocket watch that Harvey had given Henry and then reassemble it with perfect success and a 4-year-old's expression of satisfaction. "She is already something," Grace said. "Something more," Orville said, and there was pride in it, and wonder, and the particular gladness of a man who had come back from the mountain because someone kept leaving things on a rock until he was ready to pick them up. On the morning of their 5th wedding anniversary, April of 1885, Grace woke early, as she nearly always did, and lay for a moment in the quiet of the cabin listening to the mountain. The sound was different in spring than in any other season. There was water moving everywhere, the snowmelt running in every declivity and channel, and the birds were loud and the wind had a different quality, warmer at the edges, coming from the south. The aspens outside the window were in their first, lightest green. She dressed and went to the kitchen and began to bake. She made a spiced apple cake, of course she did. The same recipe she had made on that December Saturday in 1878, the same cinnamon and vanilla, the same dried apples that she now grew and dried herself. The house filled with the smell of it, and she stood in the middle of her kitchen with her hands floury and her heart full to its edges, and thought about all the iterations of this morning, the first one, alone in her small town house, wrapping the cake in cloth and arguing with herself about a flat rock on a mountain road. She heard him before she saw him, his particular footstep on the wooden floor, the sound of someone large moving with care so as not to wake the children. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his shirt and trousers, hair uncombed, beard which he had kept at its dignified trimmed length for 5 years, eyes still carrying the softness of recent sleep, and he stopped when he smelled the kitchen and stood there for a moment with an expression she had seen before, the expression of someone recognizing something. "Apple cake," he said. "Apple cake," she confirmed. He came into the kitchen and sat at the table. She poured him coffee, good coffee, the first pot of the morning, and set it in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at her. 5 years, he said. 5 years, she agreed. "I should have something profound to say about that." "You don't have to say anything profound," she said. "You never did." He was quiet for a moment, drinking his coffee, looking at her across the table with those deep dark eyes. Outside, the mountain was coming awake in the morning light, and the aspens were trembling in the early wind, and somewhere above the cabin a hawk was making its high, clean call, going nowhere in particular, everything exactly where it should be. "I picked it up," he said. She looked at him, not sure at first what he meant. Then she understood, the kindness on the doorstep or on the flat rock. The thing left for him that he had no use for, that he had said with the confidence of a man who does not know what he needs because he has stopped looking. "You did," she said. "I am glad I did," he said. "Every day, I am glad every day." She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him from behind, her cheek against the side of his head, and he put his hands over hers where they rested against his chest. And they stayed like that in the morning kitchen that smelled of coffee and apple cake, while their children slept, and the mountain came alive outside, and the fire in the wood stove ticked warmly in its casing. And the story that had begun with a woman leaving something on a rock, and a man too broken to ask for what he needed was already long and full and continuing to fill, year by year, with everything that people who love each other build when they build it honestly. A life that had no ending, only the next good morning and the one after that, and the one after that.